It is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you our symposium's keynote speaker, Stephen Pond, who is an associate professor of music studies at Cornell University. I mentioned that we had the first and perhaps only IASPM panel. What I didn't mention was the first panel. It was the first panel ever organized, and it was also, I was still a graduate student, and it was also the first time I decided I was going to cold call, or in this case cold email, a senior scholar to see if he would participate in a panel with me. And I didn't know what to expect. But we met, and especially I wanted to meet, seemed like the only other scholar interested in fusion, right? And Steve was generous to this grad student, and has remained a gracious colleague ever since. And so it's just been a real pleasure to have you here today speaking with us. I admired his work then as a graduate student, and have continued to find inspiration in his pioneering work. And I also want to just give a shout out to Larry Waite, our thoughtful co-panelists on that panel. Steve's 2005 book, Headhunters, The Making of Jazz's First Platinum Album, was republished as a paperback in 2010. The book was awarded the Woody Guthrie Prize for Best Monograph in Popular Music Studies by the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, and was a seminal work for fusion in jazz studies. His work focuses on historiography, especially as it relates to issues of authenticity and authority, race, ethnicity, class, gender, and other identity frameworks, particularly in jazz and other popular musics across the African diaspora. He is the former editor-in-chief of the journal Jazz Perspectives. At Cornell since 1999, he formerly serves as the chair of the Department of Music and currently serves as the director of graduate studies. Steve is active as a percussionist and drummer, and in addition to his academic courses, is director of Cornell's Brazilian music ensemble, Deixa Sambar. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Steve.
Well, thank you very much, and Kevin, thank you. None of that was actually true, but I appreciate the attempt anyway. So, I'm currently teaching a graduate seminar on fusion around the notion of the broken middle. Let me rephrase that. Around the notion of the broken middle. And at Cornell, it's not that we have a big cadre of students who are studying either jazz or fusion. So what I've undertaken is to apply that notion of the broken middle to other areas of interest to students so that they can think of this sort of, cross-platform way, cross-topical way. And so what I'm doing is I'm assigning maybe half or 2/3 of the readings. They're assigning the other, remainder. And the issues that are coming out of these discussions are really incredible. So I want to just kind of do two things today. I want to use the broken middle as sort of a centerpiece of what I'm going to be talking about, because I think it's really useful. And I also want to do this in a way that both honors the work of Kevin Fellez, who I admire a great deal, and to sort of say, yeah, me too, I think everything you said is right. So I don't know if I'm actually going to say anything new. I think more I'm going to say, yeah, let's think about this and figure out ways of applying this. And in my case, it's going to be applying it to the task of considering jazz history. So now I'm going to actually just read stuff. I'm going to say what I just said. I'm excited to be here with you and grateful for the invitation to speak. I have to say, I like the title of this symposium, Fusion, Remixing Jazz, Rethinking Genre in the 21st Century. Thinking about fusion offers us an epistemology, a point of entry, a mode of inquiry into understanding what jazz means today. Rethinking genre allows us to revise prior notions of jazz as a genre, or to reject the ties to genre altogether. Of course, as Kevin Fellez has noticed, fusion ain't jazz, nor is it rock or funk or any other circumscribed category. But fusion's ain'tness, its liminal position as a broken middle, becomes a means to query those categories that purportedly surround it. And as a mode of inquiry that places fusion into a relationship with jazz in particular, it allows us to further query the historical narrative that jazz as a genre depends on. I'm going to state something that I think is obvious to everyone in the room here. A good way to think of jazz is not as a genre at all, but as an approach. If I can adapt an aphorism of Ollie Wilson, jazz is a way of doing something, not something that is done. Jazz works better as a verb, I think, than as a noun, at least in my opinion. And today I look at fusion in order to understand jazz, but I'm keenly aware that shifting the prism of inquiry to view any other of fusion's many engagements, be they musical, cultural, political, or geographical, leads to different questions, and so to different answers. I see evidence of this through today's presentations. For the moment, centering on musical issues, it hasn't escaped my attention that we're meeting today in Columbia University's Center for Jazz Studies. This is not surprising, since we'd be hard put to find a comparable Center for Funk Studies, or for one of the other broad categories that lie somewhat outside the broken middle, yet exert a certain gravitational pull upon it. When people talk about fusion, it's tempting to assume we mean an expansive, if liminal, musical approach, but often there's a tacit notion of genre attached to this, under the term, when was fusion? It's also common to evoke a certain historical moment beginning in the mid-1960s and spanning a couple of decades, which can drift into well-worn notions of emergence, maturity, and inevitable decline. Following that organicist model, we should have wrapped up the fusion period around 2000. But I hear fusioning all over, and that's what I'd like to address today. Several books about fusion seek to explain the past as a way to help theorize the present. Kevin's work stands out because he correctly avoids placing jazz and genre at the center of this historical work. In my talk today, I do place some emphasis on jazz, but not to contest that important point. Rather, I think that fusion study continues to offer ways to reimagine jazz history. I've come to agree with Kevin Fellez that fusion is not a form of jazz. And I say this in all humility, given my use of the combined term fusion jazz in my Headhunters book. But I also believe that using fusion as a lens to understand jazz can be productive. Thinking about fusing as a practice helps me understand a striking trend in today's scene. The other day, I did a completely unscientific experiment. So I make no claims about the accuracy of this. It just kind of reaffirms something that I have come to see and believe. Starting with a Google search, Jazz Clubs Brooklyn, I cruised through a dozen or so venues to see what was on offer for the weekend. Keep in mind that the list is populated with clubs who have provided their websites and blurbs. They want to be on this list of jazz clubs. I was struck, but not surprised, at the variety of musical approaches I found. From a stylistic early jazz repertory band at St. Maisie's to an updated organ trio to Barbez, a club that includes jazz acts but has never focused on any particular type of music. I was particularly taken by Kiambe's dedication to Portuguese language musics of various countries, and Sandra Weigel singing Roma songs along with Tom Waits, Bertolt Brecht, and medieval troubadour works. To an eclectic mashup of blues, rockabilly. Okay, I'm a little behind. Okay, there we go. We're getting there. See all these people? Now I'll just say what I've been cruising through. So to an eclectic mashup of blues, rockabilly, country, and acid jazz, and to a quintet that alternates hard bop reimagined with experimentalist Latin jazz, alongside more reliably mainstream hard bop in tiny venue spaces. I also found a 1970s era jazz manouche reimagination, and a duo who, depending on the song, and that's what you're seeing now, might perform MPB, or MPB, Brazilian popular music, or bossa nova washed with electronics, or a viola da gamba accompanying a recomposed Joni Mitchell song from the mid-70s. It's not as if this was a special circumstance. There was nothing special about that week. Looking more closely at the club's schedules, I found all the more striking how varied their lineups were. I tried a similar experiment in the San Francisco Bay Area, and with the same result. The Black Cat featured a piano trio playing Latin jazz reminiscent of Michel Camilo's work with Anthony Jackson and Horacio El Negro Hernandez. The next night, Kenneth Whalam's all-soul styled R&B drenched in electronic effects. The next night, guitarist Isaiah Sharkey's blend of gospel, mainstream jazz, and R&B and blues, and on and on. Yoshi's in Oakland, one of the West Coast's most important jazz venues, was no different. Soul heartthrob Freddie Jackson, mentioned a little while ago, performed his hits from his 4-decade career, replaced the next night by the smooth jazz saxophonist Grace Kelly, to be followed later this month by the evergreen guitarist Larry Carlton, and who can tell which of his many stylistic hats he will wear that night. Tonight, this very night, it's the Kronos Quartet, and tomorrow and Sunday, the Bad Plus, and next week, Bob James will play in a piano trio setting, likely playing acoustic reimaginings of his 1970s work during his CTI period, as well as his smooth jazz work with Foreplay. And at San Francisco Jazz, the West Coast's answer to jazz at Lincoln Center, Charles Lloyd was set to play a 4-concert stand in 3 different trio configurations, a trio of trios. Reed's guitar bass, that's the so-called chapel trio with Bill Frisell and Thomas Morgan, a drummerless trio of Reed's piano and bass, that's with Gerald Clayton and Reuben Rogers, and a Reed's guitar tabla trio with Marvin Sewell and Zakir Hussain. The series supports a set of 3 albums, one for each configuration, to be released this fall. Explaining the approach in an NPR profile, Lloyd says, different festivals, they would ask me to play different nights with different formations, and I rather like that, because I go exploring with these other poets and sages. It was like another chance to tell the truth. Another chance to tell the truth is a thought that could have been used to describe this one. Blue Note, Robert Glasper's current residency at the Blue Note here in Manhattan, a residency he has done at the Blue Note every October since 2018. In 30 days, spread over 6 weeks, amounting to 56 shows, the residency features a dizzying number of approaches and personnel configurations. A tribute to Herbie Hancock, featuring trumpeter Nicholas Payton and saxophone John Ellis. A dinner party, a continuation of the supergroup collective that in 2020 produced the neo-soul jazz fusion EP of the same name and featured singer Alex Isley, the daughter of Ernie Isley. The collective includes Glasper, his frequent producer, saxophonist, collaborator Terrace Martin, saxophonist Kamasi Washington, and hip-hop producer and turntablist Ninth Wonder. And we saw a version of that same group last night, and it was I have to say, it was killing. Also, he'll have, he's doing the Robert Glasper acoustic, revisiting his acoustic trio that served as a complement to the Robert Glasper experiment on the 2009 double booked album, and another night with Robert Glasper with the bassist Thundercat, and as you can see here, with the revived big band in a tribute to the late impresario Megan Stabile, who regrettably passed away this year, and Robert Glasper with Yassine Bey, you may know as Mos Def. What I'm describing may simply be a marketing trend among jazz clubs to embrace diversity, to broaden their potential customer base by offering a variety of flavors. But that would seem to go against the conventional wisdom of years past, that is, establishing a stylistic brand and staying with it. I think what's going on is something broader. The artist lineups I've mentioned suggest an overall aesthetic of curational eclecticism, of remixing, by which I mean that eclecticism is a central aesthetic position. An aesthetic shift, or perhaps better said, an aesthetic intensification from years past, personalized in acts of curation and hastened in recent years by the impact of immediate and near universal internet access to music. By the way, these playbills and their eclectic descriptions may present an overview of a marketing approach, but quite often the stylistic conglomerating can shift many times during a set. And although this may seem newly prevalent, it's not exactly new. I don't think I've played or heard a jazz gig in 40 years, which reveals my actual age, that didn't include significant gestures to bossa nova, Afro-Cuban musics, or funk, purportedly through the lens of jazz. As Gabriel Solis argues in Monk's music, contemporary musicians' performances of Thelonious Monk's compositions routinely look for ways to reimagine the familiar in a process of I want to say personification, but I really am writing personalization, that often employs strategies of defamiliarization to make this possible, expressing a way of integrating past and present in their music and their lives. And let's keep in mind that their present incorporates a very large range of musical references, far beyond received notions of jazz style. This leads me to speculate, and I admit it's speculating, that the fragmentation that the term broken middle describes also very often plays out in a more granular way on the bandstand. Where I live, in upstate New York, it seems that every musician I know is in half a dozen different bands, each with a different stylistic personality. Yes, I do still find enclaves of a kind of purity, particularly hewing to bebop, hard bop, and post-bebop repertory groups. But I generally find these among student combos and college big bands. In other words, among pre-professional players who actively seek to learn and internalize foundational styles, or among professional repertory groups who seek to honor past masters as a kind of homage. In other words, despite the sometimes heated debates about the sacralizing of stylistic purity in jazz over many decades now, I believe Kevin Fellows when he says in Birds of Fire that the jazz world has always been fragmented. At times, this fragmentation has drawn critical and historiographical commentary, even perplexity. The period from the late 1950s to the mid-70s, a period I think of as the long 60s, was one of those times. John Zwed famously called 1959 the moment at which jazz ceased to follow an evolutionary handbook. But as Zwed is quick to point out, the multiple revolutions launched that year were several years in the making and saw ripple effects expanding and recombining over subsequent years. Commenting on this fragmentation at the dawn of what would later become identified as fusion, Kevin says, although the 1960s are often described as a time of fragmented jazzscape, it may be more productive to think of the period as one in which heightened accumulations of jazz styles were applied across an ever-widening set of practices and critical views. The comment about an ever-widening set of practices and critical reviews is a profound one to which I'll return. I would add that Kevin's point about jazz should be understood from the point of view that soul, funk, rock, R&B, and pop were likewise accumulating styles, and that those ripples intersected again and again, each carrying their own gravitational pull. For as Kevin correctly states, these musicians were highly selective about the composition and balance of their mixtures, neither arbitrary nor naive in their borrowings of elements. They could be unapologetically idiosyncratic in their choices for combining various genres and traditions. It's this aspect of the broken middle that I want to highlight today. The unapologetically idiosyncratic selectivity, the eclectic, purposeful curation, within the almost limitless field of possibilities that energizes fusion and perhaps jazz. These ripples included more than just music styles in contact, more than what the musicians created, or questions, as Kevin calls out, about how fusion musicians can be simultaneously inside and outside a given musical tradition. The dilemma shifts, Kevin continues, from whether fusing certain musical idioms did or did not constitute jazz or any other established genre, as we've heard today, to a question of whether a musician can ever find legitimacy across divergent traditions. This brings up a significant point of view, which I've also written about, the legitimizing role of the listener. In that work, I looked at the dancers on the syndicated show Soul Train and their power to confer legitimacy on Herbie Hancock's performance of Chameleon and Watermelon Man from the Headhunters album, not as jazz, but as funk. The shift in point of view of the inquiry's subject position materially changes the questions that get asked, and as a result, the conclusions that follow. I'll return to the question of finding legitimacy across divergent traditions, but first, let me briefly appreciate the challenge of being inside and outside, and how these also show up in divergent points of inquiry and ways of proceeding that we've been seeing today. As part of my preparation for today's talk, I looked over the abstracts for the symposium. Reading them, I was struck by how far fusion studies has come and how actively these scholars are reaching out to frame the concept of fusing. I was also struck by the variety of epistemologies and topics. By epistemologies, I don't mean to engage the full philosophical history of the word, but more as an umbrella term for three much simpler entwined concepts: the point of entry into a topic, the subject position of the actor or the point of view, and the researcher's chosen way of knowing, encompassing both research methodology and interpretive method. These are different lenses to understanding, but tightly interactive. Like a prism, they can be unbraided and viewed separately, or conjoined to show their composite meaning. Kristen McGee and Charles Carson enter their work, very different work, but both through the lens of gender and sexuality studies. Both their topics grounded in historical social moments with implications for fusion's role today. Kristen's study of Henry Mancini's Peter Gunn soundtrack points to specific musical features that index gendered attitudes and assumptions of domesticity and cosmopolitanism. Her work effectively redates fusion's beginnings several years earlier than the mid-1960s, and causes us to speculate that fusion has a much deeper stamp on jazz and popular music than previously acknowledged. It's kind of nice. Okay, it's all right. It's all right. Bob Gluck's formalist analysis of Gary Burton's early 70s bands assumes a fusion identity in a way while leaning in a jazz direction. And that lean exemplifies a factor I'm calling gravitational pull and adds dimensionality to the broken middle metaphor. Charles's use of analysis links fusion's intersections with other black popular musics, past to present, to look beyond essentialist notions of black male sexuality as aggressive, to musical processes that reflect intimacy and tenderness, and in the process destigmatizing smooth jazz. As scholars interested in fusion, a field of music with a history of being scorned and dismissed, I may have expected all the presentations to be laudatory in defense or even heroic. So imagine my relief at the three papers that productively furrow the brow. These three papers offer critiques of so-called world fusion in recent years as problematically, if not always consciously, promoting neoliberal cultural flattening and a US-centric point of view, and in the process, all offer generative alternatives. George Mira's work challenges us to grasp the multifaceted political stakes, racial, ethnic, national, class-based, religious, enacted through music styles across the Arabian region. Mark Lomano queries fusion scholarship risk of erasing or minimizing cultural distinctions by scholars not being fluent, or let's just call them uninformed, with untranslatable cultural knowledge and expression. And Steve B. Lee's unpacking of jazz minutia's origin mythology leads her to critically examine the lines between fiction and fact about fusion, by exposing these narratives' ideological underpinnings. When I wrote these descriptions, which was not today, they were based on the abstracts, and so the fullness and nuances of their arguments is certainly not adequately reflected here. Can I just say that? Okay. But I bring them up because they point in so many different directions. And yet, if there's a common thread to be found among all of the presentations today, they seem well encapsulated by Steve's project of deconstructing ideologies that color historical interpretation. We can enter consideration of fusion from many different points. Whatever point of entry we use will lend itself to certain questions, I've said this before, and not others. And therefore the answers those questions lead to will illuminate certain pathways of understanding while leaving others less examined or unexamined. With this in mind, I return to the problem of finding legitimacy across divergent traditions. Part of the challenge to me is that this legitimacy, which may be read alternatively as this authenticity, may no longer be the goal, especially for musicians removed by several decades from the feeder styles they fuse. Their belongingness may be a matter of choice rather than deriving from a primary cultural identity. In a 2017 interview, Robert Glasper argues against confines of style, asserting personal authenticity as the authority to go beyond. If you want to know about defining jazz, it's that jazz always evolves, he said. Every time jazz takes a major turn, it's because the music was going along and somebody said, fuck it, I'm doing this. Miles Davis was a walking middle finger of jazz. Kevin, not Robert, Kevin, astutely bothers confined notions of what those ever-widening practices and critical views were in the 60s and 70s, and we collectively query whatever remnants of those confined notions remain. My interest, he writes, continues to be thinking through the way fusion music sounded out the broken middle, performing the endless possibilities of variation and mixture between genres, and testing the limits of their artistic engagements against the assumptions and expectations of fans and critics. Today I have a particular application with a slight modification of that statement in mind. I seek to reimagine a jazz history that accounts for today's trend toward eclecticism. To me, the jazz trend I'm seeing is not explainable through a jazz tradition narrative of a succession of styles or of competing styles operating in a self-contained jazz world, but it is rendered legible through a point of entry that foregrounds curation. Entering jazz style developments through an attentiveness to curation helps me to better understand two quotes in particular that have bothered me for some time. The bassist and producer Marcus Miller, in a 1987 interview with Ben Sidran, discusses the Miles Davis Tutu album that he had produced. In the interview, Miller brushes off the critics' complaints about Miles's incorporation of R&B fusion. It's just music. And the lines dividing these things aren't as thick as people said, as thick as people think, Miller retorts. Musicians coming from these urban situations are exposed to all these disparate styles of music at one time in equal amounts. He's speaking from the standpoint of people who came of age around mid-1980s. While I agree with this sentiment, I just can't buy the idea of musicians being equally exposed to all musics as a practical matter. While Miller's comment may be an overstatement, however, he's right that musicians, in fact, anyone listening to radios or TV or in touch with youth culture while coming of age in the late 1980s would have had exposure to a range of popular musics alongside jazz. But that exposure would likely result in a subset within those musics, in a kind of Venn relationship. More recently, in 2015, in a Jazz Perspectives article, Gabriel Solis analyzes Pharoah Sanders' albums from 1968 to 71 and concludes that timbre in Sanders' hand, more than melodic and harmonic dissonance and more than rhythmic complexity, becomes a tool for getting outside and developing musical interests. Solis goes farther to say that Sanders's virtuosic use of timbre offers compelling evidence of historical relationships between the jazz avant-garde, fusion jazz, and black popular musics more generally in America. Again, I agree with the basic point, but I would argue that timbre's role doesn't hinge on the language of great man virtuosity. In fact, I think timbre's very ubiquity, even though barely noticed in jazz history texts and shrugged off as either unimportant or somewhat unteachable in jazz pedagogy, as David Ake has pointed out, makes the argument even more forcefully. A curatorial point of view would clarify that Sanders's expressive toolkit borrows both the sensibility of timbre from R&B, soul, and funk musics he's encountered, and the skills to deliver them. And it might clarify why he would staff his group with R&B and fusion-associated performers like Norman Connors and Stanley Clarke, and incorporate sub-Saharan, West African, and Afro-Cuban instrumentation in the service of his own avant-garde musical vision. Let's relate the case of Sanders to writing jazz history. If we want to lionize Sanders's exceptionalism, we can stand him up with pride next to all the other great man jazz figures. If, on the other hand, we place ourselves in the position of noticing connections across popular music platforms and the politics underlying these connections, we discover an answer to the question posed by Lewis Porter, referenced in my abstract today, namely, avant-garde jazz and fusion, two opposites? The answer becomes no, not opposites. Rather, avant-garde jazz and fusion are two, related. If you wonder how timbre is impacting jazz now, one way of getting there is through a 2020 live performance of a group led by Robert Glasper of Herbie Hancock's standard tune, Butterfly. Filmed under the auspices of KCRW, a national public radio station emanating from Santa Monica College near Los Angeles, the performance takes place at Apogee Recording Studios, which has been fitted out as a small club with an intimate audience. Glasper, who will be interviewed as part of the online radio show, is joined on the small stage by hip-hop producer and multi-instrumentalist Terrace Martin, whose credits include Kendrick Lamar's album To Pimp a Butterfly. Plus, and he plays a vocoder, a now discontinued model from Roland, a VP 770. Glasper is on electric piano. Derek Hodge is on electric bass. Taylor McFerrin, that's Bobby McFerrin's son, plays turntables and keys. So I'm going to play a video segment without comment so that you can get some kind of context. And then I'm going to talk about it, and then I'll play it again. Okay? The performance is about 9 minutes, but I'm only going to play the first 2 minutes of it. Maybe. Play. We did this already, so we know it works. And where's my tech guy? You had to play yours through YouTube? Okay, maybe I have to do that. Okay. Just nothing's happening. Why is that?
Oh, you gotta go to the next screen. You gotta go next to
This one's what I want to play. Oh,
That's which one?
is this a great country or what? I love this. It'll get brighter. And we launch into the solos. So I lied to you, it was more than 2 minutes, it was almost 4 minutes, but I make no apology. Let's see if I can get out of this one now. Okay, life is good. All right. So, the piece is a familiar part of Glasper's repertoire. He first recorded it in the studio for the double booked album in 2009 and has recorded it live a number of times, available on YouTube in different arrangements with different side musicians. For the KCRW concert, the audience has no warning that the song on the synth keyboard, the vocoder keyboard device, producing a gently oscillating organ sound not quite discernible as initiating a piece of music. And Chris Dave can be seen making last-minute adjustments to his drum setup. Letting the chord hover, Martin seems to be experimenting with the vocoder, emitting just a low-volume couple of distorted vocalized notes, a voice tinged with a metallic eeriness. Now as he sings or plays or sing-plays a few more seemingly disjointed scat-syllabled notes over the continuing note cluster, the audience hushes. It senses that this is the start of something. Martin's fingers on the keyboard trigger the pitches, but his voice triggers the tone, mumbled, vaguely robotic, as he seems to be noodling over a minor third again and again. Now he stabs a ja accent at the fifth scale degree, and back to the mumbled noodling. With a dial twist, his single robot voice becomes two, singing in parallel, and then in descending bass line. The noodling is gradually coalescing into a short motto, its rhythm likewise starting to focus into regularity as his head nods in time. The ja punctuations become more insistent, and the audience now knows the piece has begun. But what piece? A new metallic voice joins, an octave lower, and Martin's 3-in-1 presence penetrates the soundscape. A long drawn-out high woo comes from someone in the audience who's just figured out what song we're about to hear. Now the first gesture from a bandmate, a single-stick open roll by Chris Dave on what I think at first is a wooden disc or a practice pad, but turns out to be the high-pitched head that is the macho head of a set of bongos, timed for the silence between Martin's vocoder phrases that have now become regularized in a slow meter. A second time, and Robert Glasper's Fender Rhodes sound sneaks in with the clustery chords that everyone recognizes now. As the audience applauds their recognition, the bass, a third keyboard, and the drums slide in. What began as shrouded and otherworldly is now a commentary on Herbie Hancock's original recording from 1974 on Thrust, itself shrouded and otherworldly, a musical reference to Afrofuturism or something else. As the groove solidifies, its difference depends not merely on Martin's odd vocalizing alone, but also on the arresting weirdness of Chris Dave's drum sounds. Dave plays a kit anchored by bass drum, snare drum, and hi-hat, and from there most expectations cease. Instead of mounted toms, he's rigged a set of bongos, 3 or 4 bells and the wood blocks, and instead of tom-toms, 3 more snare drums, all vintage from the 1960s and earlier. He's since changed and alters his set weekly. His array of cymbals, and there are 7 cymbal stands besides the hi-hat, are, well, abnormal. The crash cymbal over the hi-hat is covered with embossed nodules and is bent into a shape resembling an English saddle. The cymbal in the ride cymbal position over the bass drum is similarly bent, and the cymbal is actually a set of 3 bent cymbals stacked on top of each other. And Dave uses this stack for crash effects, not for the traditional ride timekeeping function. Next to it, he has a second, oversized hi-hat cabled to a remote pedal, the top cymbal cut out with holes and looking like a slice of Swiss cheese. Here's another shot of a different performance, and so there are some differences, but they're minor differences. You start to see what his setup is looking like. Hooked onto it is a tambourine without head. Dave's pedal chicks on the hi-hat set the tambourine jingles in motion like a sizzle cymbal, but clankier. Straight ahead is a small splash cymbal, also stacked, and with triangular cutouts on the top cymbal in the stack. Now, near each of his elbows, Dave has hung cymbals cut in a spiral form from rim to crown, suspended from 5-foot-tall stands. So now I'm going to play it for you again, that you've had all that commentary. And I'll just play the first 2 minutes this time. For a second, I forgot you guys were here, and I just wanted to keep listening. So, and I have not mentioned the presence and importance of echo and reverb in this construction, right? So, on the one hand, we tend to think of drums, especially in certain periods, as being quite reverberant to impart a sense of drama, of size, of space, of grandiloquence even. Here, it's very dry, except for the cymbals, which are studiously trashy, right? To make a certain kind of emotional jangling, force you into that situation. What is reverberant and not dry are the vocoder and the piano, which are drenched in reverberation. The upshot of all this is that Butterfly is overrun with timbre. Whether we hear Martin's processed voice in pictorial terms, saturated with Afrofuturist sci-fi film conventions, or perhaps chanted in an unrecognized language, or a kind of meditation punctuated with momentary cries, we can take as faith that the sounds mean something. We understand timbre as conveying emotion, even if we don't have a purchase on what emotion exactly. This is part of what makes the moment musically interesting. It's intriguing and a little confusing that the timbres don't have a clear referent. We just know that the timbre has a way of both portraying and inciting emotion, locating meaning in the listener. The musical reference is confusing, that is, until the timbred notes coalesce into the opening groove of Butterfly. The Fender Rhodes sound Glasper has chosen replicates the sound of Herbie Hancock's Rhodes on the original performance on Thrust, a sound that Hancock consistently replicates in performances throughout his career, as well as on Herbie's own cover of the song on the album Dis Is Da Drum. And the sound that Glasper also consistently replicates, whether on an actual Fender Rhodes or a multi-timbral synthesizer in recordings or in live performance. The audience sighs out a sound of recognition and approval. Do they recognize the song as a jazz standard? Do they recognize the history of Herbie Hancock's performances of it, on Thrust or Dis Is Da Drum, or the many live versions, Hancock or otherwise, on YouTube? Or do they connect the song with Glasper himself, or with their past experiences of hearing the song in performance, on Spotify? Who were they with and what were they doing? Eating dinner, making love? In each association, odds are that the chords and melody are the same. The tempo is the same, or close enough. What's different? The soloing, of course, which will always be different. But also, I argue, the timbre creates a new emotional envelope. Gary Tomlinson, in a masterful... that's all right, I may be out of line here. Gary Tomlinson, in a masterful synthesis and recap of evolutionary biology and cognition science and how humans perceive music, comments with a certain awe that human sensibility to timbre differences is astonishingly refined and complex. But we already know this intuitively. Timbre becomes a driver, a trigger, and an enactment of emotion. This leads us to think more deeply about emotion and what it signifies. For this performance, at least, timbre or timbres, layered and intersecting, act not as clear Persian semiotic references to earlier associations. Rather, they invoke unarticulated emotions. As references, they are not directly conceptual nor tied to unfolding narratives in the way we might think of as harmony, as syntactical, and refers by following or flouting to rules of ordering. Since timbre does not work through narrative whatsoever, it invites us to consider the idea of affective meaning of a succession of emotional states and how timbres contribute to it in jazz. David Ake, Ken Prouty, and others have called attention to the fact that jazz pedagogy, especially as it entered the front doors of the Academy in the 1960s and 70s, has inherited a durable note-centric bias from legit music education models. Partly, this reflected the training and ingrained sensibilities of band directors who were adding jazz to their course loads. Partly, it reflected music establishments' anxiety over timbre as too emotional laden, or rather too base and unrefined. But in the meantime, jazz players were accruing ever-widening exposure to all kinds of musics that paid a lot of attention to their timbral message: blues, gospel, rock and roll, rhythm and blues, soul, funk, as well as a host of styles, approaches, and instruments from across the Caribbean and elsewhere. All of these became sources of stylistic exchange across the broad expanse of popular music. If we want to stretch a point and allow, or even pretend, that music gets conveyed by means of pitches, those pitches accrue meaning through the grain of the voice, by which is meant also the timbre of the instrument. Now, let's restrict ourselves for a moment to only considering one instrument complex, drums and percussion, and how they have transformed over time. The most common conception of the drum set is as a rhythm machine. I think of it as a timbre machine. I'm currently at work on a project that traces the relationships of drum set and, pointedly, cymbal manufacturing and style development over a 60-year span. Without belaboring the point, here we have the state of things around the middle of the 1960s. Without belaboring the point, the growth of numbers of drums for the drum set, the addition of hand drums, bells, and noisemakers to accommodate stylistic demands for various popular and international musics, and the stunning growth in cymbals, both in numbers and the types of special effects symbols around the set, and of drumhead technologies and approaches to tuning and reverberation, it's overwhelming. And these changes in instrumentarium, beginning in the mid-1960s, have both reflected and enabled changes in drumming style across the entire field of popular music. In particular, they became closely identified with fusion's first wave and with various nodes of avant-gardism. And while I'm at it, similarly stunning changes have accompanied keyboard development, both reflective of technology, changes in aesthetics, and playing style. And these changes are in no way restricted to fusion or experimental musics. One might go so far as to call them a medium of stylistic exchange in a marketplace of cultural affiliations that inhabit the broken middle. A marketplace of cultural affiliations is one way of visualizing gravitational pull within the broken middle. It's hard to imagine conjoining different styles of music or different traditions associated with them without conscientious selecting, curation, among the enormous set of possibilities. How we navigate those possibilities, indeed how we become aware of them in the first place, has everything to do with the history of record distribution, a topic I've studied from more than one point of entry, first as part of my research into the success of headhunters, and more recently in tracing the history and impact of the jazz reissue. With the overall development in the recording industry to digital file exchange and streaming services, exemplified by, you name it, SoundScan. What am I trying to say? SoundCloud, thank you very much. Netscape, yeah, that was it. It was okay, great. And other things. And the other things, importantly, include Spotify. YouTube, too. The curatorial eclecticism I earlier confronted in jazz club playbills comes into focus. You thought I was never going to get back there. Spotify's Discover Weekly and Daily Playlist features and the algorithm collection that drives them are together both a symbol and a director of a move toward a kind of taste making at a granular level. Based on each listener's listening experiences and practices, Spotify's artificial intelligence algorithm coordinates 3 techniques to suggest tracks that are surprisingly accurate in predicting the listener will like them. Collaborative filtering, natural language processing, and raw audio analyzation. In the briefest of terms, AI-driven collective filtering. This is you as a result of those things. Collective filtering collects keystroke signals and internet hits to register implicit feedback. It tracks how often a listener streams this song as opposed to that song, as well as what portion of the song they listen to, whether the listener saves the track to their playlist or accesses playlists that contain the track, as well as whether and how often the listener visits the artist page, the lyric page, or accesses metadata such as personnel credits. Then it adds this information to an enormous matrix of listeners and their practices to create a database. You didn't know you were being surveilled that way, but you are. Natural language processing grabs metadata provided by the label and scans the internet for both descriptive and evaluative words in news articles, blogs, and other text. It also analyzes the track's lyrical content to add to the matrices of users and songs for curatorial matches. So far, these analyses curate the tracks that the listener has already heard and preferred. Together, they can be seen as a kind of high-tech word-of-mouth recommendation system, like sharing mixtapes on an unimaginable scale. Importantly, genre is only one factor in this curation. Finally, raw audio analyzation uses spectrogram analysis across a very finely calibrated array of sonic attributes, from the beats per minute or mood to melodic and harmonic features to finely parsed timbral attributes. Then it comparatively ranks a listener's preferences across those elements to forecast what other tracks, which the user has never heard before, is likely to like. In other words, operating as if the entire universe of recorded music, that is, under contract to Spotify, resides in the broken middle. The elements that are already joined together in ranked order on a particular track that the customer probably is going to enjoy are among the deciding factors on what turns up on the playlist. So Spotify is able to create customized playlists in which the genre, in quotes, is whatever the listener likes. In other words, Spotify curates eclectically, taking into account the gravitational pull of the listener's tastes. This is the complement to the jazz clubs and the musicians in the jazz clubs and their own curatorial eclecticism, their own remix approach. I don't think so. I don't think we're at a post-genre point, but the trend is happening. So, today's presentation gives ample evidence that fusion studies is fragmented, and thankfully so. The contradictions in points of view can be brought into a productive space if we recognize that different points of entry into a subject like fusion will lead to different questions and so to different answers. Fusion studies as a thing apart can be a productive conceptual path, but we should also value the gravitational pull in divergent epistemologies that present themselves. Points of entry, points of view, and ways of knowing will be different, whether conceived as fusioning, broken middle, remixing, a web of affiliations, or another metaphor. Thank you.
There's a question I was wondering is, like, when I think about the whole concept of a mixtape, at least for me, it was always about trying to jam together the most improbable combinations, like going from, Madball to Billy Eckstein, or from Francoise Aldi to KRS's Sound of the Police. Do you think that the AI that they use is capable of picking up on that in a listener and actually throwing things at them that are, meant to be as far removed from what they listen to?
My best friend, maybe I don't have a best friend. My best friend has tried to fake it out, and what it's gotten is something that approaches his very eclectic taste. This is a funny thing, because when I was growing up, certainly, I think everybody in the room when you were growing up, part of the fun of being a teenager was to turn somebody on to something totally wacko, right? And on the one hand, you had a great reliance on top 40 radio and its verification of your taste as, of the mainstream. You could be part of the crowd. But right behind that was your buddy that was sending you a mixtape exactly as you described it. And one of my other friends from high school had a favorite aphorism that he used to always say, which is, "I too am a nonconformist." So I think that Spotify has figured out something along those lines, and I've been very scarily satisfied, at the things that they push my way.
Thanks, Steve. I've never actually had a chance to hear you talk in person. That's great.
Very lifelike, right?
Remarkably so, actually. So I want to go back to the part of your talk about timbre. And I'm trying to understand a little bit better what you mean about the influence and attention to timbre and how it finds common ground and touch points. Because when I think about it, and I agree that like textbooks, scholarly books just have never had any kind of concept at all, and it was really too bad. But I think of the big bands as being about, rhythm and timbre. The moment when Herbie Hancock starts being really harmonically vague in 1965, what he's playing is really about timbre in a sense, right? Kind of tone, what's that mush? It feels like something. And somehow the infiltration of, the experimental musical world and electronics and stuff into the recording studio, and all of a sudden you have, pet sounds and you name it, and Herbie Hancock. And so what do you see aside from this movement being really operating in popular culture now, although big bands were popular culture back then? What is the significant difference that you see now as opposed to some of that lineage?
I think that in the 60s, right, if you were contemporary in the 60s and seeing these things develop in real time, you would maybe have a deeper attachment to either the embrace or the resistance of those timbral elements, right? If they were in your head violating a more mainstream notion of what jazz should be, especially if it was signaling an intrusion by popular music, you would have a particular point of view. But as Marcus Miller, I think, is kind of right when he says, he was specifically talking about people his age and maybe a little younger who was, they didn't have skin in that game. It wasn't so much they were worshiping at the altar of anything, they were just exposed to all this stuff. So I think that has continued apace. And sure, there are plenty of people who feel a sense of the sacred, about, let's say, bebop aesthetics held over, right, as they developed in the 60s. Herbie Hancock, I think we could call it timbre, we could call it gesture, some kind of interesting combination of those. But his description of it has more to do with harmony or a resistance to kind of formal harmony, functional harmony. But still, I think that somebody growing up now, Robert Glasper, has less of an attachment to whether or not he's violating something. It's more like, here's all the things I know, and here's all the ways I can get there, and I can make some kind of emotional statement by doing this time.
Thank you for this talk. I'm going to ask sort of an obvious question, but I just sort of want to hear you speak on it as somebody who is an authority on the topic. So I'm writing a book on early jazz and race and money. So I'm interested in the commercial aspect of jazz. And I get a lot of critiques for the way that not a lot, but a lot of people are, why are you calling this jazz, right? So if I'm writing about Paul Whiteman, or why are you calling this jazz? It's not jazz. They didn't understand what jazz was yet. It hadn't coalesced into this singular genre. And I've been really inspired by fusion studies people because it helps me make sense of the 1920s. But I also see that time period is like the people that are using jazz as a marketing term and blending a ton of different genres together are just like desperately commercial. And I don't mean that in a kind of derisive way. I just mean like it is what it is. And when you started your talk, you were showing the clips from clubs, and it just sort of reminded me of like, jazz clubs that are just desperate to get anyone in the door and like listing, sort of a series of any genre that might connect with somebody who's looking at the website. So I just wonder to what extent this kind of eclecticism, I love this idea of the broken middle, is in.
My idea.
Oh, it's your idea.
It's Kevin's.
Okay, sorry.
From Isabel Anderson, right? Yeah.
How much of it is sort of money motivated, and especially now you also talked about how some of the kind of broken middle or eclecticism is because everything's so accessible, but because everything is so accessible, the marketplace is more competitive, and everyone's sort of desperate to create some kind of new sound that so they can sell uniqueness in some way. So I'm just wondering, like, where does the kind of money commercialism fit into this?
The money now or then?
Whatever you want to talk about.
Well, again, I'm going to be totally speculative. Okay, so can we
Isn't that
agree
what we
that
all
that's
do?
what I'm doing? Yeah. Okay. So, in the 40s and 50s, if you were a touring R&B band, you would tour not to support the album. You would, or not to support the record. You would have the record to support your touring. Right. That changed in the mid 60s. With self-contained rock bands that started going on tour, and you would tour to support the album. I think it's gone back the other way. And so people are selling recordings or merch or whatever, and they're selling venues, right? They're selling the tour. Just because of this sea change that's happened in distribution. I mean, I don't pretend to have an inside track there. This is just observational on my part. But most musicians I know are doing some kind of self-production, some kind of self-promotion, whether it's on something like SoundCloud or whatever, and using that as a lost leader, in a sense, to get some kind of touring going on. Right? So that, in a way, is throwing back to an earlier time. You know, Scott DeVoe has much to say about this, and you know, it's just a beautifully written book. As far as, I thought you were going to ask a different question, so I was like, all set to answer that one. No, that's all right, We can talk maybe a little bit later, but unless there's no other question, but I have a feeling there's one or two.
I know you said earlier you hate when people take a minute to sort of think through things on the microphone, but I want to ask you about the other half of that question, as I see it. Curatorial eclecticism, right? Like a really powerful phrase from your talk. One of the things that I've taken away from today is sort of the idea of ambivalent politics of fusion, right? That on the one hand, we have these commercial and capitalist interests, and we know, for example, and you did an excellent job in your talk of sort of outlining the processes through which curatorial eclecticism is deployed, right, by something like Spotify for the purposes of consumption, right, to get people to buy in, to spend money, right? I want to ask you about the other side of the ambivalent politics, which is, like, if you look at Glasper, right, he has an aesthetic philosophy about breaking down genre in black music. When you talk about the broken middle, like, I'm automatically thinking of The Break, right? When you talk about Herbie Hancock and his uses of fusion, there's, you know, the sense of diasporic belonging, right? So I'm going to invite you to be speculative, again, to talk about the sort of the other side of the ambivalent politics. Why musicians, why audiences would choose to engage in this curatorial eclecticism, whether it's identity formation, whether it's a sense of imagined community, right? Like, what do you think is at play on the other side of, like, capitalist interest?
Let's talk about first the production side of things. I think that part of what I said a little while ago, I think is actually operative, that people are less attached to fealty to a particular kind of genre, right? And I think that genre, I mean, I speculated and then dismissed the idea that we were in a post-genre age, but, you know, it's post-genre-ish, right? And I think that there's not necessarily a sense of, you know, all of these things having an equal claim on us. We all pick and choose, right? But we all pick and choose among an expanded menu of things that it used to be. I think that is about both aesthetic considerations, but aesthetics is cultural, always cultural. And so what appeals to me, and I might think that it's just because of the way the music sounds are happening, no, it's about my sense of identity. And the identity that either I was born with, which may or may not be true, but certainly the one I choose, right? And we all are members of multiple communities. So I think that I'm interested in how these things are pastiched together, you know, how they're pasted together. And no two people will do that in the same way, and so I think that has a lot to do with this notion of curatorial eclecticism. From the opposite side, from the marketing side, in a way this may be circular. The forces that allow or legislate somebody to be as eclectic as we're talking about from a production standpoint would also gratify a listener, right, who has myriad things to identify with and can find something pleasing, you know. In my book, I mentioned Ollie Wilson, and through Ollie Wilson, I mentioned Incatia, you know, Gwabene Incatia, who talks not about Africa as sort of this big monolith, but folks within Africa who have similar cultural aesthetics, practices, beliefs, and so on, as communities of taste. And I think that's an effective way of thinking about this. Communities of taste, in the way Incatia talks about it, is a little bit more solidified and monolithic. You know, it's just that they coincide. In us, I think it's more granular, more person to person, that we see ourselves as parts of various communities of taste. And those tastes, again, are always cultural. Does that answer?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm so thrilled because. Okay.
Oh, it's not.